visuals. So I wanted it to be non-representational and just kind of feel and express.
And you used only 2 programs, right, to create this?
Yeah, bouncing back and forth between Photoshop and Illustrator, essentially. And this actually was sampling a whole series of 20 prints that led up to this large-scale piece that I could freely sample and drop in and include in this piece as well.
Were you listening to the music while you were working on the piece?
Not my music.
No, not your music. Okay.
No. This was commissioned by Art Foundation in Austin, the Austin Fairchild Art Foundation, and this was the 7th and last, it turns out. They were doing a Thanksgiving project. They had a building at 6th and Congress in Austin, and they had done large window installations for 6 years. They sold the building, they bought a building down here, moved in. They didn't want to do a window thing, but they commissioned me to do a print, which expanded into 3 prints, and the theme was thankfulness or gratitude. And the previous work that they had done in the windows featured a lot of language, a lot of verbiage and so forth, different expressions of gratitude in different languages and things. And again, I just wanted to deal with it. I just wanted it to feel, essentially.
And of course, this is now in the SAMA collection. We're very proud to own it. And this is your most recent, well, partly your most recent. You want to explain what we're looking at?
Yeah, this was a commission. Last year I received the center panel I did in 1994. And the owner of that painting has been interested in, he'd been interested in turning it into a triptych. And I had been turning him down for years. I stopped painting for about 12 years. And then he approached me a little over a year ago and asked me about it again. And at first I was trying to convince him that I should do the 2 side panels digitally on paper. And he was kind of okay with that. But then I realized I was actually missing painting enough that I felt like maybe it was time to get back into it. But I wasn't quite sure, so I kept making demands, and he kept meeting them. And so finally it was like, okay, there's really no way out of this. And it was actually good to get back into, because I felt like I could what I was trying to do is mimic essentially where I was at in that painting in 1994. So it became more of an exercise of just kind of recovering chops as much as anything else, remembering how to paint.
But at the same time, everything you were doing in the digital work with the triptychs and like with Gratitude ×3, having the 3 panels sort of each correspond to the other and all interrelate, suddenly you were doing that now with a paintbrush.
Well, I had been doing that before too, a lot, David. Actually, it was really hard. The examples I gave you for the most part were single panels, but I've done a lot of diptychs and triptychs. It's really hard for me actually just to not kind of have them expand that way.
So are you continuing to paint now?
I took some time off in the last 6 months to work on a show that opens next week, or actually this Saturday.
And where will people be able to see that?
At the Flight Gallery, 1906 South Flores. But yes, I'm painting again.
Well, welcome back to the world of painting, and thank you, James Cobb. Our next artist is Mark Hogensen. Mark has lived in San Antonio for 20 years. He holds a BA and a BFA from Oregon State University. After his undergraduate studies, Mark worked for 12 years building crates before returning to school to study art full-time. After receiving his MFA in 1990, Mark accepted a full-time teaching position with Palo Alto College, where he currently is a full professor. Join me in welcoming Mark Hogensen. Okay, so we start in the mid-90s here. You can see it on here. Yeah, same thing. Okay. Altered State, acrylic on wood panel. Tell us where your vocabulary comes from. It's sort of predominantly abstraction. How did you get into making these shape paintings in the first place?
Well, initially I was making paintings of this same ilk, but I was working on canvases, and when I would get to the end of the canvas, I was always a little bit frustrated that there should be a little bit more out there, I guess. And so there was a period in time where I was adding actually wooden shapes to the edge of the canvas. And that became a logistic nightmare, and moving and setting them up and whatnot, and the transition from canvas to wood was awkward. And so it wasn't any stroke of genius, and I just should cut these out of one piece. And so that's what I did. And a slight correction in the introduction, I didn't spend 12 years building crates. I did some other things along the way there. I was actually building houses, but in the building trades nonetheless. So
Right.
familiar with wood and plywood and all of that. And
So I'm assuming that influenced the vocabulary to some extent there.
I was a builder, and then I was also in school in architecture, and so I was always interested in perspective and the manipulation of space. And the shapes, I think, I've always been interested in abstraction from a very early age. My surroundings growing up were abstract paintings on the walls of our house. My parents had abstract art in the little town of Corvallis, and I know my friends came over and scratched their head wondering what that was about, but it always made perfect sense to me in shapes that weren't completely literal. But then the colors and the shapes of cartoons and the onomatopoetic, is that the right word? Shapes that suggest sounds and splat and that kind of Batman sorts of things fall into these things as well. And the wood frame is sort of a reference to that kind of pops up a lot in some of these earlier paintings, in that they were sort of references to the traditional painting, the frame of the painting, and it appears at the bottom, the sky's at the bottom, and so forth. And this particular painting was sort of started in response to a friend. I'd been in Texas for about 6 years at this point, I guess, and a friend, a painter in Oregon, asked me, well, now that you've been in Texas for this period of time, has it influenced your painting? And I sort of scratched my head thinking about that, if I'd really been influenced by being in Texas and so forth. And so I thought, well, maybe I should, maybe think about that in this painting. So it's kind of hard to see in here, but this lower portion of the paint against the sky there, it's a little piece of a sort of cutout Texas shape that's sort of flipped up there.
You're talking about the state, the shape of the state?
That's the bait. I'm sorry. It's sticking out the left side of the vertical frame there is sort of West Texas and a little bit of the panhandle up there. So, and then there are architectural plans drawn into the details of that. So that was my response to my Texas influence there, and hence the title Altered State. Which can also be applied to the Psychedelic show.
Right. Speaking of which, Loud Acreage, which is in the show and in Sam's collection, how did this evolve from the last one? Now it's not quite as architectural.
Well, again, there's the frame, reference to the frame, and this painting sort of coming out of the frame and expanding beyond the frame and creating, this background. So it essentially becomes sort of a three-dimensional.
How do you arrive at the overall shape for a painting like that?
Most of these shape paintings always started out as small sketches, maybe 6 by 6, or to scale what I might blow them up to eventually. And it would be layer upon layer and erased and layered, and so the drawings were really worked until there's a ploy of contrast. If something is a deep space, then I want something to come forward from that. If something is a round organic form, then I want a sharp edge against that. Something soft, and the same with the color. It's a really pretty simple formula, and there was somebody told me one time I shouldn't be revealing these secrets, but I said, well, it's just a couple of primary colors and a little tweaking here and there, and I see these as being very sort of formally based. And as far as the decisions go, I mean, they're intuitive
Aesthetic
decisions.
responses, intuitive responses. Now, when you were working on this painting, were you working on multiple paintings at the same time, or did you focus just on one painting at a time?
I often had more than one or two paintings going at the same time.
So in a sense, they're interplaying all together.
Yeah, and as one would be finished, then I'd approach the next one, and then I'd look back at that one and say, okay, well, that one has this really dark space back beyond, and so this next one I want to, change that up and make the things, some of the forms going back in there. So, each one was sort of a progression based upon the previous, I guess.
On the Horns of a Dilemma. Now here you've introduced open sky into the work.
Yeah, the blue of the clouds, you mean?
Right.
Yeah.
The black, that's just background, right?
The black is background, with the exception of the black in the interior of is actually painted black. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So it's a solid piece. There's no holes through it, but the form itself follows the outline of the plywood.
Okay.
Yeah, the sky, I think this was probably the first painting the sky really entered into it in as sort of a major form. And I also started leaving more plywood behind. The ends of the cones are just a natural wood, and you can see the grain of the wood in them. So that sort of implies this three-dimensionality. And the grain of the wood, and I have some other paintings that really rely more upon the grain of the wood because in contrast to the paint, it becomes pretty fabulous.
Well, actually, and this is one thing that a digital reproduction can never truly capture. When you go into the gallery and you look at Mark's paintings, you'll see in Loud Acreage, for example, there's quite a variety of texture that you've used within a single painting.
Yeah, and that's something that I've sort of fallen away from, actually. That was sort of earlier paintings were, it was a way of getting more contrast into the surface, different kinds of surface treatments. But the titles also in some of these now, I kind of use these, I've just gone blank, on the Horns of a Dilemma, something that sort of, it's a phrase that sort of obscures meaning, but at the same time reveals some meaning. And so I always like the idea of playing along those kinds of lines in these.
And I assume you're also responding to the horn-like element in the painting at the same time.
Yeah, that sort of becomes suggestive of that.
And I also assume that the title usually comes when you're finished?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Now this is a real interesting one because it has none of the color of all the others. So tell us about this one.
Yeah, this is what I was referring to. This is all just the raw wood. It's all birch veneer plywood, a high quality grade plywood, and the grain is really quite beautiful. And a lot of the paintings, previous paintings we looked at, start out looking like this, just blank plywood, and with lines, pencil-drawn lines, and then some of the areas that are going to receive paint get gessoed and so forth. So this was just lined out, ready to kind of go in that direction. And then I ended up making, I think I did a series of 4 of these paintings that all had this same sort of treatment, the raw wood, but with the lines. And then the lines, because of their color shift and so forth, change and create these shapes. But if you follow a line around, it sort of subverts some of the things you would think, well, that should have been the other color. So have you been interested in optical illusions at all? Oh, yeah.
I know with the Psychedelic show, we've talked about that with, say, Richard Anaskevich and some of the other artists.
Yeah, I really enjoy that kind of thing. I'm not particularly interested in painting it. However, one of my first paintings that I did in high school was all about that. It was, the classic image of primary colored 3 sides of a cube, stacked in line, so you look at them one way and they shift the other way as you look at them. So this was one of my first large-scale paintings when I was like 17. It was like 5 by 5, and it ended up becoming in a house in college where we lived. And one night in a certain revelry, it ended up as receiving bow and arrow shots.
Who was the shooter?
Well, I wasn't the first, but I joined in after a while, so it's all good.
Okay. Not the way to treat your art.
Well,
Okay.
you know.
All right. Now we're back to obviously a lot of complexity, and there seems to be a little bit of decorative patterning entering, decorative in a good sense, not a pejorative sense, patterning entering into this one.
And a lot of the same ideas, but just sort of expanding on it. At the bottom there, the sky appears in the bottom in an irregular shape, and then on top of that is the wood grain that's been emphasized with little airbrushing, and the black and white pattern that's introduced again by a traditional frame. And then the title of the piece, Join Here, comes from very center element. It's a piece of wallpaper from the 1950s, and there's one little area of the wallpaper exposed along a seam that says "Join Here," and so that's where that all sort
Well,
of.
and I look at this painting and I think about your background as a builder, not of only crates, but of many
Yeah.
things, and I assume you do carpentry as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it seems to find its way into this painting. Whether or not.
And this is the spelling again is sort of the idea of suggesting, two ways of looking at these words or two ways of looking at the work. And there's some definite illusionary sorts of things going on in particularly in the piece of sky in the center and how it matches up with the wood grain that's been airbrushed on that blue form to the right of that. And so they both share a common edge there, so it flexes back and forth there.
A well-oiled machine, which is hanging in the show. This is in the UTSA collection. And now it's gotten very complex compared to the earlier ones.
Yeah, and I suffer from that malady called horror of vacui, where I'm sort of afraid to leave any space untouched. But oddly enough, I really have a personal aesthetic that I'm dear to in terms of minimalism. And when I mention this to people after they look at my artwork, they really can't believe that. And I like things around me all the time, but I really have an affinity towards clean, empty, modern lined types of architecture and that sort of thing. But yeah, so these just became more complex, putting more and more layers in, more and more directions to look at. And for me, they're like, it's always fun to go and look at them. And I've had a lot of people say this to me, that they always see something new when they go to look at it. And to me, that's a good thing.
Do you remember how long you worked on this one?
Well, let's see, there's a painter you could quote. I think somebody asked Matisse one time, or Monet one time, how long it took him to do that, and he said his whole life, or maybe it was Picasso, I don't know. But
Well, yeah,
so,
that's true in a cumulative sense.
This doesn't have this is like a 4 foot by cut out of a 4 foot by 8 foot piece, and that's a month's worth of work, I suppose. On and off, not every moment, but.
And you've also done some commission works. This is
for the San Antonio water system, and this was I think it's 9 feet by 17 feet or something like that. And they were really happy with it at the time, and but when they got installed and several of the people from the top offices came down to look at it, they were a little distraught over all of the leaking water on the pipes. And I said, well, I could fix that, but I'd have to charge them at a plumber's rate.
So is it still hanging there?
It is.
Yeah.
It's a sauce. And actually, one of the top engineers came in and said, no, this is actually the way it happens. There's no water system that doesn't have leaks. And so I felt,
Guess that makes you a realist.
yeah.
And then recently you've also done a number of drawings, charcoal on paper. This is a series about landscape. So
Yeah.
a bit of a shift here. Tell us about how that came about.
Well, I think that, in those paintings, there's always seems to be some sort of relationship to the sky or the ground, and maybe not a landscape in traditional sense, but I've always been intrigued at how you can put a horizontal line across an empty page, and people in Western culture see it as the horizon line, and
Yes.
it's the simplest sort of relationship, but it offers a wonderful opportunity to deal with space, distant spaces, and these sort of mysterious, and it really, all my charcoal drawings are so different than the paintings, because the paintings are all sort of planned out, and they're painted and they're taped and they're very precise, and the charcoal drawings I just start drawing and see what happens. Then I tackled a little bit of still life. I figured, well, if I'm doing landscape, I can do some still lifes, and so I've always sort of been intrigued with the mass and quality and quantity of objects in the old 16th, 17th century Dutch still lifes. And there's a term for them called pronkstilleven, which means sort of opulent or completely over the top sorts of landscapes. And you're familiar with those, and there's some in the collection here, Severine, and with bugs and insects and crawling in droplets of water and these kind of things. And so I introduced a couple of insects into these as well, and there's like a falling diagonal, and it's just total.
But they're not ants, are they?
No, it's way too small, but beetles and crickets and that sort of thing. And then the frames are all painted on to look like frames with this flat surface again.
Are those trompe l'oeil frames then?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so they're not literal frames.
No.
And then this recent series, Road Trip.
Yeah, that ended up being a series of 9 paintings, and they were all about. They were actually painted for an exhibit titled "Going Mobile," and there were several different artists curated in the show, and by Kimberly Aubuchon, I might add. And so these were my interpretations of different travels or transversing through the landscape.
But they could be more like through the universe than the landscape that we.
Yeah. And I think as abstract as they are, they're pretty universal in that they have this kind of winding road heading back into the distance, and the mystery of what's around the next corner, and all of that sort of thing.
And there's another one which is in our exhibition, and then I think these are the most recent drawings you've done, correct?
That's right. This is for a show at Solidías last year, and these were about 40 by 50 charcoal drawings. And again, as my paintings are sort of organized and thought out, these just start out as a couple of lines on the page and just keep growing.
Yeah. What's going to happen next? Are you going to continue with the drawings? Are you going to make some more paintings?
Actually, this is from a series called Town and Country, and I've been thinking more and more about that idea, and I'm actually embarking on a series that's going to involve the membrane or the whatever it is that exists between town and country. So that's what I'm heading for next.
Outside the loop.
Outside of that way outside the loop, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Mark
Thank you,
Hogensen.
David.
Next up is Constance Lowe. Constance studied culture theory and criticism from 1986 to 87 at the University of Minnesota, Minneapolis. In 1973, she received a BFA from Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And in 1979, she received her MFA from Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo. Constance has been an Art Pace resident and a recipient of an Art Pace travel grant and a Visual Arts Award from the San Antonio Artists Foundation and an Arts Midwest National Endowment for the Arts Artist Fellowship. She is professor in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Texas in San Antonio. Welcome, Constance Lowe. Okay, so a slight departure from what we just saw, conceptual-based work. I know we want to get through it, so why don't you go right into it? tell us about this work and what it's made from, what it means?
I'm probably not going to do much of that. And I feel like we just did this when it was about a year ago.
Well, it was a
we
couple
went
years
through
ago
this.
already,
Yeah,
yeah.
it probably is. But I think
Different audience, too.
oh yeah, of course. I've always been an image maker, and I've always been a questioner of those images that I make, like never being quite satisfied or sure about what I want them to do or how I want them to evolve. And so I think maybe one thing that'll ride through all the images that you'll see is an interest both in image and in material and a play between the two. So this is a painting from, when is it, 89, that it's fairly large. It's 4 by 6 feet and has both trompe l'oeil elements in the illusionistic nameplates that say scent and memory, scent on the left and memory on the right, as well as actual objects, which are glass vials sitting in those iron sconces physically on the surface of the painting. And I think maybe what is characteristic, again, throughout the work is this trying to ask an artwork to do a couple different things at one time. So to be a painting, but not be a fully flat as a painting. And the images are, is obviously a beehive or honeycomb, bees and honeycomb on the left, and the image on the right is based on an X-ray. I think it's actually a human esophagus, but I guess that does play, the fact that it's the swallowing apparatus is important to the image. So I'll leave the assumption of meaning up to
Well,
the viewer.
what's interesting, though, as I look at it, now having been through the psychedelic exhibition and the work you're currently doing, I'm seeing an interesting relationship in that you've got a sort of symmetrical situation set up here, and yet within the symmetry are two very different individual entities. So we'll come back to that idea when
Well,
we
that's
look
always
at
the fun thing about going back in your work and you see things, the connections that you didn't realize would continue at the time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This piece, which is in the Salmon collection, Untitled from 1992, would you remind us a little bit about the issues on this one?
Well, the actual objects attached to the previous painting were a precursor to my desire to really move away from the painted surface altogether and to, instead of depicting objects, to actually use objects. And this was done when I moved to San Antonio, and I think whenever you change your geographical location, it frees you up to explore things that you didn't consider previously or were kind of keeping on a back burner. So based on that change, I was able to start exploring some sculptural concerns connected to my work and to build things out from that flat surface. And I was really interested in using these blankets, partially because of their military background, but also because I really loved the material and the fact that they were a recognizable object that was both an object and a surface on which to paint. And I can't really explain the decisions in this piece. They were very intuitive and just prompted by kind of what I thought at each decision prompted another need in the work. But I think my work always toys with possibilities that elude any kind of fixation in language, so that it's not any one thing, that it suggests elements of domesticity, it suggests elements of industry. The boxes, which I thought of as kind of breathing apparatus or ventilators, also were, people had seen insect cages that they reminded them of, which happened to be an interest of mine, and things sort of start dovetailing outside of my control. But one of the things about this piece, and this will carry through a lot of the other work that we see, is I found out that I was really interested in making work that didn't seem like I made it, if that makes any sense. But it
looks like it has a logic to it.
Seems a logic that was motivated and manufactured for a functional purpose without that being obvious or clear. Yeah. This is part of that same body of work. That body of work, which is called Appetite for System, involved a lot of different forms and a lot of different materials. You could see sensibilities carrying through, but it was really work that worked best in installation for that reason. So this piece is also related, but you talked earlier about the symmetry, and heterotaxia refers to a reconfiguration of things being out of order. For example, in the human body, when organs are not where they're supposed to be. So I think that plays into what I'm doing now as well. And the only thing about, I guess two quick things I'll mention. And
Well, the imagery on the wood also reminds me of
Yeah.
some of your recent work.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think that I knew that I didn't want to do a whole series of work based on plywood imagery, but I was really, really attracted to it. And Mark mentioned that earlier too in his work. But I think the work that I do now gave me a way to revisit that in a way that made sense to me. A couple quick things about this that also continue through my work, and one is an interest in reproducing and reproduction, meaning that I talked earlier about not always questioning the images that I was making, and here I was using found imagery, both in the plywood and also in the upholstery fabric, the floral fabric, but that it was all repainted, so that there was a lot of labor put into the piece. It was way in excess of what one would need. I could have just used the fabric alone. And I painted over it, and then I repainted it so it looks more like realistic dead leaves and petals than the more decorative live ones. And then the jar that you see, you won't be able to tell from the audience what it is, but it's a jar with a cone of bread that's been allowed to mold. And I just cleaned those out literally last week when I moved to my studio. They were really dead, but they were still there. Again, going back to the notion of function that I talked about a minute ago, this piece is obviously a chair. It's upholstered just like any regular chair, except using a color that I could never keep in my house. There's something impractical about it. And it's also what I learned was called a slipper chair, so it's not quite regular scale. It's lower to the ground, so a woman at her vanity, I guess, could reach over and put on her slippers. But I added the belt. Just as a way of self-containment. I guess I don't really want to go too far in interpreting it because I didn't mean for it to have a specific interpretation.
But to be suggestive of multiple interpretations.
Absolutely, yeah.
And this was your art pace residency?
The main component was there were 24 cast bronze butterflies that hovered over a pool of kind of acid green rubber. Kind of that, it's the same stuff that fake ketchup or fake vomit is made out of, so it continually looks wet and fresh. But I was interested in, and I think this is continuous too in my work, I was interested in the idea that things that we take for granted are images that are ubiquitous, such as the butterfly, which we see as being a sweet cliche kind of image, came from something very real that has a real life and a real genetic code that motivates it to do certain things. And one of the things that I was reading about butterflies was that they are liquid feeders and we think of them as flitting from flower to flower, but they also feed on carrion and urine and all sorts of nasty liquids that we wouldn't be so likely to associate them with. So I was interested in kind of skewing those perceptions. And the installation included a couple sculptures that were, technically they are fiberglass over styrofoam, but they are, again, made to look somewhat naturally occurring or accidentally occurring industrially. We're not really quite sure. And these are topped by two mating butterflies, or two sculptures of mating butterflies, obviously. This is my first foray into the more symmetrical. It's actually, I did it for the project room that Ethel Shipton ran at Blue Star for a while. And it's called Now or Never because the actual configuration is the words now or and the word never back to back. I had already started doing the work that we'll see next with the ink blots, and I was playing with that idea that the two sides, that it's symmetrical, but it's not, the two sides are not a mirror image to each other.
And that's actually how things really are in nature. Things that we
Exactly.
think are mirror images really are not. Just look at your two hands, for example,
Yeah.
and you'll be very aware of that.
Oh, there's really famous images of when you take half of your face and you flip it, it doesn't look like you
Exactly.
anymore. Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the work now that we have in the Psychedelic exhibition, and it's in colored pencil on drafting film. Why drafting film?
Because that's what I had when I started. No.